The field kitchen smoked quietly in the morning haze, several kilometers behind the front line. April 8th, 1943. The Kursk region. A deceptive calm hung over this sector of the front, the kind that makes soldiers nervous because they know it never lasts. The spring thaw had turned the roads into rivers of mud, and somewhere beyond the distant tree line, the German and Soviet armies were preparing for what would become one of the greatest battles in human history. But on this particular morning, in this particular spot, there was only the smell of boiling gruel and the crackling of firewood beneath two massive iron cauldrons. 7 men moved through the forest with practiced silence. German reconnaissance soldiers, part of Unteroffizier Miller's detachment, had been operating behind Soviet lines for 3 days now. They survived on dry rations, slept in brief shifts in wet ravines, and moved only when they were certain no one was watching. Their mission was straightforward enough on paper: identify the positions of Soviet reserves, disrupt supply lines where possible, and return with intelligence that might prove valuable for the coming summer offensive. The Wehrmacht command had been sending such groups deep into Soviet territory for weeks, probing weaknesses, mapping positions, creating chaos where they could find opportunity. When they spotted the smoking field kitchen through the morning mist, it seemed like a gift from fate itself. No guards, no sentries, no defensive positions, just a solitary figure moving around the massive cooking equipment, stirring something in one of the great metal pots. Miller signaled his men with practiced hand gestures, and they began their approach. 3 soldiers moved to cover the flanks, 2 positioned themselves to guard the retreat route, and 2 advanced directly toward the kitchen itself. The textbook execution of a simple snatch operation. They would be in and out within minutes, perhaps taking a prisoner for interrogation, definitely grabbing whatever food and documents they could carry. The figure by the kettles was a young woman wearing a stained apron over her military uniform. Her hair was tied back in a kerchief, her hands and face smudged with soot from the cooking fire. She stirred the contents of the enormous pot slowly, methodically, seemingly oblivious to the armed men now surrounding her position. A typical image of Soviet army life. Women pressed into service as cooks, laundresses, and support staff because the Red Army was scraping the bottom of its manpower barrel. Or so the Germans believed. This is what their training had taught them to expect. This is what their propaganda had assured them was true. The reconnaissance soldiers emerged from their concealed positions almost simultaneously, forming a tight ring around the kitchen. 7 Mauser rifles and MP-40 submachine guns all pointed at the single Soviet servicewoman, who made no attempt to flee or resist. Miller approached first, his rifle at the ready, calling out in broken Russian for her to raise her hands. The woman complied slowly, lifting her flour-dusted hands away from her body in a gesture of surrender. Her face showed fear, that universal expression the German soldiers had seen countless times when capturing prisoners. Just another unlucky cook who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. An easy capture, a minor victory in the greater scheme of things. But they did not know who stood before them. They could not see the countless hours spent on a shooting range in Voronezh, where her father had been an instructor in marksmanship. They did not know about the badge she had earned in 1939, the Voroshilov sharpshooter insignia of the 2nd degree, which required not just accuracy but speed, not just skill but steel nerves under pressure. They could not guess that this seemingly helpless woman in a dirty apron had grown up with the weight of a rifle in her hands before she could properly read, had learned to calculate windage and bullet drop before she understood algebra. The German soldiers saw only what they expected to see: a defenseless woman, a soft target, a simple addition to their list of minor tactical successes. A rifle leaned against a wooden crate near the kettle, seemingly forgotten, or at least not immediately accessible. It was a 3-line rifle, the Mosin Nagant model of 1891/30, the workhorse of the Russian and Soviet armies. Simple construction, proven reliability, deadly accuracy at ranges up to 1,000 meters in the right hands. 7.62 millimeter caliber, a weapon that had seen service in 2 world wars and countless smaller conflicts. This particular rifle had its own history, its own story of training sessions and target practices, its own relationship with the young woman who knew every scratch on its wooden stock, every quirk of its firing mechanism, every tiny adjustment needed to compensate for distance and wind. The Germans relaxed their guard. Miller lowered the barrel of his submachine gun slightly, studying his prisoner with a smirk that suggested both contempt and satisfaction. 2 of his comrades were already moving toward the kitchen equipment, intending to check the contents of the kettles and the food crates. The other 3 maintained a perimeter watch, but their attention was drifting. What possible threat could one young woman with a ladle pose to 7 armed professional soldiers? The mathematics of war seemed clear and indisputable. The situation appeared completely under control. They were already mentally composing their report to command about the successful raid on a Soviet field kitchen and the capture of its crew. The distance from the woman to her rifle was less than 2 meters. The distance from her to the nearest German soldier was approximately 5 meters. In military tactics, there exists a concept called critical distance. That space where an enemy is too close for effective aimed fire, but too far for hand-to-hand combat. The Germans believed they controlled this distance, calculated this geometry of death, understood the angles and the timing. They were mistaken. They had made assumptions based on appearance rather than capability, on gender rather than training, on expectation rather than reality. These assumptions would prove fatal. Miller took a step forward, pulling rope from his pocket to bind the prisoner. His companions continued their inspection of the kitchen, already anticipating the taste of whatever was cooking in those huge pots. Nobody noticed how the young woman shifted her weight slightly, assuming a more stable stance. Nobody caught the quick glance she directed toward the rifle near the kettle. Nobody recognized these as the final preparations of a trained marksman assessing targets, calculating distances, prioritizing threats. These were the last seconds of relative calm for Unteroffizier Miller's reconnaissance detachment. They had walked into what they thought was an easy ambush. Instead, they had stumbled into a trap, one they had set for themselves through their own underestimation of the enemy. While the German soldiers advanced with their weapons raised, convinced of their easy victory, they remained ignorant of the true history of the young woman standing before them with raised hands. Her name was Maria Kostromina, 22 years old, born and raised in Voronezh. Officially, she served as a cook for the field kitchen of the 304th Rifle Regiment. But the real story of who she was and how she came to be standing at that kettle on that April morning began many years earlier, in a very different world that now seemed almost impossibly distant. Her father, Pyotr Kostromin, had been an instructor in marksmanship at the city shooting range in Voronezh. After Maria's mother died when the girl was only 5 years old, Pyotr raised his daughter alone, and the shooting range became her second home. While other girls her age played with dolls and practiced needlework, Maria spent her afternoons among the smell of gun oil and burnt powder, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing in her ears like a familiar lullaby. Her father did not simply teach her to shoot. He taught her to understand firearms, to feel the weapon as an extension of her own body, to anticipate the recoil before it happened, to read the invisible currents of wind that could carry a bullet off its intended path. From the age of 8, Maria could field strip a Mosin Nagant rifle blindfolded. By 10, she could calculate bullet trajectory accounting for distance, wind, and temperature. By 12, she was outperforming adult shooters at the range. Her small hands surprisingly steady, her eye remarkably precise. Her father watched with quiet pride as his daughter mastered skills that most men struggled to acquire. He never pushed her, never demanded perfection, but he recognized in her a natural talent that could not be wasted. The rifle felt right in her hands in a way that few other things in her young life ever had. It was not violence that drew her to shooting, but precision, the pure mathematical beauty of making a bullet travel exactly where you intended it to go. The year 1939 marked a turning point in Maria's life. At 18 years old, she decided to attempt the examinations for the Voroshilov Sharpshooter Badge of the second degree. This was not a simple marksmanship test. The first degree badge, awarded to those who could shoot accurately with small caliber sporting rifles, was relatively common. But the second degree required shooting with actual military weapons, the same rifles that soldiers carried into battle. The standards were punishing. Hitting moving targets at 300 meters, shooting under time pressure, demonstrating not just accuracy, but speed and composure under stress. Many experienced military marksmen failed these tests. Most women never even attempted them. Maria passed on her first try with scores that impressed even the hardened military instructors who administered the examination. She fired the full-power 7.62 mm cartridges without flinching, her shoulder absorbing the heavy recoil as naturally as breathing. She hit targets that other candidates could barely see through their iron sights. When the results were announced, her father stood in the back of the range, tears streaming down his weathered face. He did not need to say anything. The pride in his eyes said everything that needed saying. Maria wore her Voroshilov Sharpshooter Badge with quiet satisfaction, knowing it represented not just a test passed, but years of dedication, countless hours of practice, a skill honed to a razor's edge. The three-line rifle became her constant companion. She learned to recognize the individual characteristics of different weapons, understanding that no two rifles shot exactly the same way, even if they came from the same factory on the same day. Her personal rifle, the one she trained with most frequently, had a tiny imperfection in the barrel that caused bullets to drift slightly left at extreme distances. She compensated automatically, adjusting her aim without conscious thought. She knew which part of the trigger pull required the most careful pressure, at what angle the rifle sat most comfortably against her shoulder, how the sight picture should look in that final instant before the shot broke clean and true. Then came June 22nd, 1941, the day that changed everything. The day that Germany invaded the Soviet Union with more than 3 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and complete confidence in their ability to crush Soviet resistance within weeks. Maria's father volunteered immediately. He was too old for frontline service, but the Red Army needed instructors, needed experienced marksmen who could teach others to shoot. Before he left, Pyotr took his daughter aside. His final words to her were simple and direct. "Remember everything I taught you. It might save your life someday." She nodded, unable to speak, watching him disappear into the chaos of mobilization. She would never see him again. He fell in March of 1942 during the brutal fighting around Rzhev, killed by German artillery while training a group of young conscripts. Maria volunteered for military service in October of 1941. The local recruitment office was overwhelmed with volunteers, mostly men, but they were also beginning to accept women for support roles. The official policy was clear. Women would not serve in direct combat positions. They could be nurses, telephonists, drivers, and yes, cooks. Maria's marksmanship skills were noted in her file, but considered irrelevant to her assigned role. The military needed women to free up men for the front lines, and cooking was considered an appropriate feminine contribution to the war effort. She was assigned to the field kitchen of the 304th Rifle Regiment in November of 1941, just as the first serious winter snows began to fall. The field kitchen was built on a design that dated back to the early 20th century, developed by a colonel in the Imperial Russian Army named Anton Turshanovich. It was a marvel of practical engineering. A two-kettle system mounted on wheels, capable of preparing hot meals for 250 soldiers in approximately 4 hours. Each massive kettle could hold enough soup or porridge to feed an entire company. The kitchen traveled with the regiment, sometimes pulled by horses, sometimes by trucks when fuel was available. Always moving, always working, always essential. Without hot food, soldiers lost the will to fight. The field kitchen was not just a cooking apparatus. It was a symbol of care, of home, of survival itself. Maria discovered that being a military cook was far more difficult than she had imagined. She worked 16-hour days, starting before dawn to prepare breakfast and finishing long after dark when the evening meal was finally distributed. Her hands, once steady enough to place bullets within centimeters of each other at 300 meters, became rough and burned from handling hot kettles and chopping frozen vegetables. She learned to cook vast quantities of simple food: barley porridge, cabbage soup, the occasional luxury of meat when supply lines permitted. She learned to stretch inadequate rations to feed hungry soldiers, to make something edible from ingredients that seemed barely fit for consumption, to keep the fire burning even when the wood was wet and the wind was howling. But she never forgot her father's lessons. Her Mosin Nagant rifle went with her, officially issued as part of her equipment, theoretically for self-defense in case of enemy breakthrough. In practice, most support personnel rarely touch their weapons, except during mandatory inspections. Maria was different. Whenever the regiment was in a relatively safe rear position, whenever she had a few hours of rest, she practiced. She found quiet spots where she could shoot at improvised targets, maintaining her skills, keeping her eyes sharp. Some of her fellow cooks thought she was strange, perhaps even obsessive. But a few of the older soldiers, veterans who understood the chaos of war, nodded approvingly when they saw her at practice. They knew that in war, you never could predict when a cook might need to become a fighter. By April of 1943, Maria Kostromina had been serving with her regiment for 17 months. She had survived the brutal winter of 41 to 42, had endured the desperate fighting around Moscow, had witnessed more death and suffering than anyone her age should ever have to see. The war had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with the calendar. She was still only 22, but her eyes held the weariness of someone much older. She had lost friends, had seen good people torn apart by shells and bullets, had learned to continue working even when grief threatened to overwhelm her. She performed her duties as a cook with quiet competence, earning respect from both the men she fed and the senior sergeant who commanded the kitchen detachment. Her personal rifle remained with her always, kept meticulously clean despite the difficult conditions, its mechanism oiled and functioning perfectly. She had carved tiny notches into the wooden stock, not to count kills like some soldiers did, but to mark the passage of time, each notch representing a month survived. The weight of the weapon was familiar and comforting, a tangible connection to her father and to a life that now seemed to belong to someone else entirely. When she held the rifle, she could almost hear Pyotr's voice guiding her. Breathe slowly, squeeze gently. Let the shot surprise you. These lessons, learned on a peaceful shooting range in a city that now lay in ruins, would soon prove their value in ways neither father nor daughter could have imagined. The moment hung suspended like a breath held too long. 11:47 in the morning. The German soldiers had made their fundamental error, the mistake that separated living soldiers from dead ones. They had relaxed. Miller stepped forward with his binding rope, confident in his numerical superiority. Two of his men rummaged through the food crates, already imagining the taste of real food instead of dry rations. The three perimeter guards shifted their attention outward, watching for Soviet reinforcements rather than the woman they had already dismissed as harmless. In that instant of divided attention, Maria Kostromina made her decision. Her body moved before conscious thought could interfere, muscle memory overriding fear and doubt. 2 steps to the rifle, 1 fluid motion to grasp the familiar wooden stock. The weight settled into her hands, like coming home. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Speed matters, but accuracy matters more. Make the first shot count. She brought the rifle up in a practiced arc, the butt plate finding her shoulder pocket exactly where it belonged. Her cheek pressed against the stock. Her eye found the rear sight. The world narrowed to that tiny space between the front post and the first target. Miller, the closest threat, 5 meters away. His eyes widening in sudden understanding that came 1 second too late. The rifle fired. The recoil drove back into her shoulder, familiar and welcome. Miller jerked backward, his expression transitioning from surprise to pain, to nothing at all. He fell heavily, the rope slipping from his fingers to land uselessly in the mud. His submachine gun clattered against a cooking pot, a metallic sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden shocked silence. For perhaps half a heartbeat, nobody moved. The other Germans stared at their fallen leader, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. That half heartbeat cost them everything. Maria's hands worked the bolt action with practiced efficiency. Eject the spent casing, chamber a fresh round, lock the bolt, acquire the next target. The German soldier to her right was reaching for his weapon, mouth open to shout a warning. He never got the chance. The second shot caught him in the upper chest. He spun partially around from the impact before collapsing against a food crate, sliding slowly down to sit on the ground with a puzzled expression, as if he could not quite understand how he had ended up there. Blood spread across his field gray uniform in a dark stain that looked almost black in the morning light. Now the remaining soldiers understood their situation. Training and instinct took over. They scrambled for cover, for their weapons, for any advantage that might save their lives. But they were caught in the open, exposed, with nowhere to hide except behind the inadequate shelter of the field kitchen itself. Maria worked the bolt again. Third round loaded. One of the perimeter guards was turning, bringing his Mauser rifle around. She fired before he completed the motion. The bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him completely around. He fell face first into the wet earth and did not move again. 3 down, 4 remaining. Perhaps 15 seconds had elapsed since the first shot. The 2 soldiers who had been searching the food crates dove for the ground, trying to make themselves small, trying to become invisible. One of them got his submachine gun into position and fired a burst in Maria's general direction. The bullets went wide, hitting the kettle behind her with a series of metallic pings that sprayed hot water into the air. He had not taken time to aim, had fired from panic rather than training. Maria dropped to one knee, making herself a smaller target, and worked the bolt. 4th round. She tracked the muzzle flash back to its source. The German soldier was trying to scramble behind the wheel of the kitchen's transport cart. Not fast enough. She led him slightly, accounting for his movement, and squeezed the trigger. He jerked once and lay still. 4 down, 3 remaining. The mathematics of the engagement were shifting rapidly in her favor. But she could not afford to think about that now. Thinking meant hesitation, and hesitation meant death. She operated on pure trained instinct. The countless hours on the shooting range distilled into this moment of ultimate necessity. Another perimeter guard broke and ran for the tree line, deciding that survival meant retreat. He was perhaps 20 meters away when Maria acquired him in her sights. Running target, moving perpendicular to her position. Difficult, but not impossible. She remembered her father's teaching. Lead a running man by twice his body width at this distance. She calculated the necessary offset automatically and fired her fifth shot. The running soldier stumbled, caught himself, took 2 more staggering steps, and fell. The bullet had caught him in the leg, shattering bone. He tried to crawl, dragging his useless limb behind him, making small animal sounds of pain and terror. Maria worked the bolt again. 6th round. 2 Germans remained, both somewhere behind the kitchen equipment, both still armed. She could hear rapid breathing, the metallic click of someone checking their weapon. The initiative had passed to her completely, but she was not safe yet. 2 trained soldiers with automatic weapons could still kill her if she made a mistake, if she got careless, if luck turned against her. A voice called out in German, words she did not understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. Surrender. Negotiation. Perhaps a plea for mercy. Maria said nothing. She shifted her position slightly, moving to get a better angle on the space behind the kitchen cart. Movement caught her eye. A field gray sleeve, a flash of pale skin. She fired without conscious decision. The 6th shot punched through the thin metal of the cart and elicited a sharp cry of pain. A submachine gun fell from nerveless fingers, clattering on the ground. The German soldier slumped into view, clutching his side, blood welling between his fingers. His eyes met Maria's across the short distance. She saw fear there, and pain, and the terrible understanding that he was dying, far from home. 1 German remained, the last of Miller's reconnaissance team. Maria could hear him breathing, could sense his position, even though she could not see him directly. She had 1 round left in the rifle. 7 shots total in the Mosin Nagant's internal magazine. 6 Germans down, 1 round remaining for 1 target. The final soldier made his decision. Instead of fighting, he ran. He burst from cover and sprinted toward the forest, abandoning his wounded comrade, abandoning any pretense of military discipline. Pure survival instinct drove him now. He had perhaps a 20-meter head start and was moving fast, faster than the wounded man she had shot earlier. Maria rose to her feet, bringing the rifle up smoothly. The running man was already 40 meters away and increasing the distance with every stride. Difficult shot, moving target at extended range. But she had made harder shots on the range, hitting moving silhouettes at twice this distance. She led him, accounting for his speed and direction, breathed out slowly, felt the trigger break. The rifle fired its 7th and final shot. The running soldier's leg buckled beneath him. He crashed down hard, rolling, clutching at his thigh. Not a killing shot at this distance and angle, but enough to stop his flight. He lay in the grass, writhing, his cries carrying across the suddenly quiet morning. Silence descended like a curtain falling. 7 German soldiers, 8 seconds of violence. Well, perhaps slightly more than 8 seconds when she counted from the first shot to the last, but not much more. Maria stood beside the field kitchen, the empty rifle still at her shoulder, her breathing surprisingly steady considering what had just happened. Smoke drifted from the barrel. The smell of burnt powder hung in the air, mixing with the incongruous scent of cooking porridge. 6 Germans lay dead or dying around the kitchen. The 7th was disabled, wounded, no longer a threat. She had survived. Against all probability, against 7 armed professional soldiers, she had survived. Her hands began to shake. The rifle suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She lowered it slowly, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the engagement was draining away, leaving behind a hollow weakness. She looked at the bodies scattered around her cooking station, at the blood soaking into the spring mud, at the wounded Germans still crying out in pain 40 meters away. These were not targets on a range. These were men, had been men. They had families somewhere, mothers who would receive notifications, wives who would become widows, children who would grow up without fathers. She had killed them. She, Maria Kostromina, 22 years old, a cook in the Red Army, had just killed 6 human beings. Maria sat beside the field kitchen, the empty rifle across her lap, trying to control the trembling in her hands. The wounded German continued his irregular cries from the tree line, sometimes loud, sometimes reduced to weak moaning. She did not go to him, could not go to him. Her legs felt disconnected from her body, and besides, he might still have a weapon, might still pose a threat even wounded as he was. So she sat and waited, surrounded by the dead, the morning sun climbing higher in a sky that seemed offensively beautiful, given what had just happened on the ground beneath it. The patrol arrived 17 minutes later, drawn by the gunfire. A squad of Soviet infantry emerged from the forest, weapons ready, moving cautiously toward the kitchen. Their leader, a scarred sergeant named Volkov, stopped dead when he saw the scene. 6 German bodies in field gray uniforms, blood on the ground, shell casings scattered around the kitchen, and Maria, sitting alone with her rifle, her face pale as milk. Volkov approached slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter something fragile. He crouched beside her, his weathered face creasing with concern. What happened here? His voice was gentle, the tone one might use with an injured child. Maria found her voice somewhere deep inside. The words came out flat and mechanical, a simple recitation of facts. 7 Germans. Reconnaissance patrol. They surrounded the kitchen. She reached her rifle. She fired 7 shots, 6 down immediately, 1 wounded and fled. Volkov listened without interrupting, his eyes moving from Maria's face to the bodies and back again. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and began issuing orders to his men. Secure the perimeter. Check the German bodies for documents. Find the wounded one before he bleeds out. And someone get Senior Sergeant Petrova. The kitchen commander needed to see this immediately. The wounded German, Corporal Manfred Hoffmann, was discovered trying to drag himself deeper into the forest, leaving a trail of blood through the wet grass. 2 soldiers carried him back to the kitchen and laid him on the ground, applying a rough bandage to his shattered leg. He was young, perhaps 20 years old, his face twisted with pain and fear. Through an interpreter, a private who spoke passable German, they learned the details of the reconnaissance mission. Müller's group had been operating behind Soviet lines for 3 days, mapping positions, noting troop movements, specifically tasked with identifying reserve concentrations in preparation for the summer offensive. The information was valuable, more valuable than the soldiers who extracted it perhaps realized. Senior Sergeant Anna Petrova arrived within the hour, her broad face registering shock when she took in the carnage around her field kitchen. Petrova was a veteran of the Finnish War, a hard woman who had seen more than her share of violence. But this scene clearly surprised even her. She walked slowly around the perimeter, counting bodies, examining weapons, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Finally, she approached Maria, who had not moved from her position beside the kitchen. Petrova studied her young cook for a long moment before speaking. "Can you stand?" Maria nodded and rose on unsteady legs. "Good. We need to write a report, and you need to tell me exactly what happened. Everything." The report took 2 hours to compose. Petrova was meticulous, questioning Maria on every detail, every sequence of events, every shot fired. She measured distances, examined sight lines, collected the spent cartridge cases. She questioned Sergeant Volkov and his men about what they had seen when they arrived. She had the German bodies searched, collecting their papers, their maps, their personal effects. Everything was documented with careful precision, because Petrova understood that this was not a simple matter of self-defense. This was a significant tactical event, and the regimental commander would want complete information. One young woman had eliminated an entire enemy reconnaissance team. Such things did not happen often, and when they did, questions needed answers. Lieutenant Colonel Vershinin, commander of the 304th Rifle Regiment, received Petrova's report with evident skepticism. He read it twice, frowning, then summoned both Petrova and Maria to his field headquarters. The regimental command post was little more than a reinforced bunker with a canvas roof, but Vershinin maintained strict military formality within its cramped confines. He stood behind a makeshift desk covered with maps and documents, his gray eyes moving from Maria to Petrova and back. This report claims that Private Kostromina single-handedly eliminated 6 German reconnaissance soldiers and wounded a 7th, in approximately 8 seconds, with 7 shots from a Mosin Nagant rifle. Petrova stood at attention. "Yes, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, that is correct." Vershinin's skepticism was evident in every line of his weathered face. One woman against 7 professional German soldiers, trained reconnaissance troops. He paused. "Forgive me, Senior Sergeant, but this seems unlikely." Petrova reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a small metal badge, placing it on Vershinin's desk. The Voroshilov sharpshooter insignia, 2nd degree, with Maria's identification number engraved on the reverse. "Private Kostromina earned this in 1939, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel. She is the daughter of an Army marksmanship instructor. She has been shooting since childhood." Vershinin picked up the badge, examining it closely. His expression shifted from skepticism to thoughtfulness. He looked at Maria with new interest. "Is this true, Private? You are a qualified marksman?" Maria nodded. "Yes, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel. My father trained me from a young age." Her voice was steadier now, some strength returning. "I have been shooting for 14 years. Vershinin was silent for a moment, thinking. Then he picked up a field telephone and made a call to division headquarters. Within 2 hours, a team arrived to investigate the incident. A major from the intelligence section, a captain from the political department, and a medical officer to examine the bodies and the wounded prisoner. The investigation was thorough and took most of the afternoon. The major interviewed Maria for nearly an hour, going over her story multiple times, looking for inconsistencies or exaggerations. He examined the scene personally, measuring distances, checking sight lines, having Maria demonstrate her shooting position and technique. He questioned Sergeant Volkov and his entire patrol. He supervised the interrogation of Corporal Hoffman, who confirmed through tears and pain that yes, one woman had shot all of them, that it had happened so fast they had no chance to react properly, that they had underestimated her completely. The major's report would eventually reach Army headquarters, but his verbal assessment to Vershinin was succinct. "It happened exactly as she reported, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel. Quite remarkable, actually." The German prisoner provided intelligence that proved more valuable than anyone initially realized. Miller's reconnaissance group was one of several operating in the sector, all gathering information for the planned summer offensive. Hoffman revealed drop points, radio schedules, recognition signals. Under interrogation, he described the broader intelligence-gathering operation, the Wehrmacht's desperate need for information about Soviet defensive preparations around Kursk. This information was immediately forwarded up the chain of command, where it contributed to the larger intelligence picture being assembled by Soviet counterintelligence. One small engagement at a field kitchen had unexpectedly compromised part of German reconnaissance operations in the entire sector. For Maria, the immediate aftermath brought a strange mixture of reactions from her fellow soldiers. Some looked at her with newfound respect, even awe. Others seemed uncomfortable around her, as if proximity to violence might be contagious. The men she cooked for treated her differently now, more carefully, with a wariness that had not existed before. She was no longer just Maria the cook. She was Maria who had killed 6 Germans with 7 shots. The story spread through the regiment rapidly, acquiring embellishments with each retelling. By evening, some versions had her killing 10 Germans. By the next day, some claimed it was 15. Maria did not correct these exaggerations. She barely spoke at all. That night, alone in the tent, she shared with 2 other women from the kitchen detachment. Maria finally allowed herself to break down. She wept silently into her blanket, her body shaking with sobs she could not control. The faces of the German soldiers haunted her. Miller's expression of surprise, the young soldier she had shot while he ran for the trees, the wounded one crying in the grass. They were the enemy, yes. They would have killed her or captured her without hesitation. But they had also been human beings, and she had ended their lives. Her father's training had prepared her for the technical aspects of shooting, but not for this emotional weight, this terrible knowledge of what it meant to kill. The German command received news of the reconnaissance team's fate through multiple channels. When Miller's group failed to make their scheduled radio contact, search procedures were initiated. Aerial reconnaissance the following day spotted the bodies near the Soviet field kitchen. Later, through intelligence channels and prisoner exchanges, the story of what had happened filtered back to Wehrmacht headquarters. The initial reaction was disbelief, similar to Vershinin skepticism. Professional reconnaissance soldiers did not get wiped out by lone cooks, regardless of gender. But as evidence accumulated, as the facts became undeniable, the incident was filed away as a cautionary tale. May of 1943 arrived with unseasonably warm weather and the distant thunder of artillery that never quite ceased. The 304th Rifle Regiment formed up in a muddy field behind the front lines, soldiers standing in neat ranks despite their exhausted faces and worn uniforms. Lieutenant Colonel Vershinin stood before them, a small wooden box in his hands, his voice carrying across the assembled troops. He read from the commendation document, his words formal and precise. Private Maria Kostromina, for exceptional courage and effectiveness in combat against enemy reconnaissance forces, for eliminating 6 German soldiers and capturing valuable intelligence. The medal for courage the men applauded, a sound like distant rain, and Maria walked forward on legs that felt disconnected from her body. Vershinin pinned the medal to her uniform, his weathered face softening into something approaching a smile. He shook her hand with genuine warmth. The soldiers applauded again, longer this time, and Maria understood that this was not merely recognition of one violent morning in April. This was acknowledgement that she belonged here, that she had proven herself in the most fundamental way possible. She was no longer just a cook who happened to be a woman. She was a soldier who happened to work in a kitchen. The distinction seemed small, but felt enormous. She accepted the medal with military precision, saluted properly, and returned to her place in the formation. The weight of the decoration against her chest felt heavier than its actual metal substance could account for. Life continued with the relentless momentum that war demanded. The field kitchen returned to its normal rhythm of preparation and service, though Maria noticed that her fellow cooks treated her differently now. Senior Sergeant Petrova began asking her to train the other kitchen personnel in basic marksmanship and defensive tactics. These informal lessons took place in the evenings when the cooking was finished and the equipment cleaned. Maria showed them how to hold a rifle properly, how to aim, how to breathe. She taught them to think about their surroundings tactically, to identify cover and concealment, to understand fields of fire and dead ground. Most would never need these skills. But after April 8th, everyone understood that the rear areas were not truly safe, that war could find you anywhere. Summer brought the great battle that German intelligence had been preparing for when Müller's reconnaissance team died at Maria's field kitchen. The Battle of Kursk erupted in July, with an intensity that made all previous fighting seem like rehearsal. The 304th Regiment participated in defensive operations on the southern face of the salient, and the field kitchen worked nearly around the clock, feeding soldiers who came back from the front lines with 1,000-yard stares and hands that shook too much to hold their mess tins steady. German aviation pounded rear positions relentlessly. Artillery shells walked back and forth across supply roads. Several times the kitchen had to displace rapidly under fire, hitching the heavy kettles to whatever transport was available and moving to safer positions. In late July, a Stuka dive bomber caught the kitchen during one of these displacements. The scream of its engine filled the world as it dove, and Maria threw herself flat an instant before the bomb hit. The explosion lifted her and slammed her back down, driving the air from her lungs. When her hearing returned through the ringing in her ears, she heard Petrova shouting orders. The bomb had damaged the kitchen's wheel assembly, and German tanks were reported advancing along this very road. They had perhaps 30 minutes to repair the damage or abandon the equipment. Maria joined 3 other women under the damaged cart, working with wrenches and makeshift tools while shells burst close enough to shower them with dirt. They got the kitchen mobile again, with perhaps 5 minutes to spare, pulling away just as the first German tanks appeared on the distant ridge. Autumn found the front line moving steadily westward. The Red Army had survived the German offensive and now pressed its own advantage. The 304th Regiment advanced with the tide, following in the wake of the tank columns and rifle divisions that spearheaded the offensive. The field kitchen covered dozens of kilometers each day, stopping for a few hours to prepare meals before moving again. Maria grew thin from the constant physical labor and inadequate rest. They all did. But nobody complained because they understood they were winning now. That each kilometer westward was a kilometer closer to the end of this terrible war. Winter of '43 brought illness. Maria developed a persistent cough that would not respond to the limited medical care available. The regimental doctor, an exhausted captain who looked older than his 40 years, diagnosed bronchitis and insisted on hospitalization. Maria refused until her temperature climbed so high that she could barely stand. 2 weeks in a medical battalion facility, lying in a canvas tent listening to artillery in the distance. Another week of convalescence before she was cleared to return to duty. The bronchitis never fully left her, lingering as a chronic condition that would plague her for the rest of her life. A small price, she told herself, compared to what so many others had paid. Spring of '44 found the regiment in Belorussia, liberating towns and villages from 3 years of German occupation. Maria saw the aftermath of occupation everywhere. Burned houses, mass graves, gaunt civilians emerging from forests where they had hidden from German patrols. These scenes strengthened her resolve, reminded her why the war had to be fought to final victory. Whatever doubts or guilt she felt about the men she had killed that April morning faded when confronted with evidence of what occupation meant. The Germans had not come as liberators or even as conquerors who would eventually establish some kind of order. They had come as destroyers, and they deserved no mercy. Summer brought Operation Bagration, the great offensive that destroyed Army Group Center. The 304th Regiment became caught in a tactical encirclement for 2 days when German forces attempted a counterattack. The field kitchen found itself inside the defensive perimeter along with the combat troops. And once again, Maria picked up her rifle. She took position alongside infantry soldiers in a hastily dug trench, her Mosin Nagant ready, her hands steady despite the circumstances. The German attack came at dawn, infantry supported by a handful of tanks. Maria fired carefully, conserving ammunition, each shot aimed at a specific target. The attack was repulsed by the combined efforts of all defenders, and relief forces broke through the encirclement within 36 hours. August brought another medal, the Order of the Red Star, presented for her participation in the defensive action and for systematic performance of duties under difficult combat conditions. The ceremony was shorter this time, conducted by a division commander who was already thinking about the next phase of operations. Maria accepted the decoration with the same quiet dignity she had shown in May. She wore both medals on her uniform now, the only woman in the regiment with combat decorations. Some soldiers viewed her with superstitious awe, as if she were blessed or protected by fate. Others simply treated her with the respect due any proven warrior. Maria preferred the latter response. Her role expanded beyond cooking. In autumn of '44, Army headquarters summoned her to a meeting with staff officers who had reviewed her record. They proposed a new assignment: instructor at training courses for support personnel. Cooks, drivers, communication specialists, supply clerks. All the people who kept an army functioning but who rarely received combat training. Maria would teach them basic marksmanship, tactical awareness, immediate action drills for ambushes. The skills that had saved her life could save others. The assignment removed her from heavy physical kitchen labor, but also separated her from the regiment she had served with for 3 years. She accepted with mixed feelings, understanding the importance, but missing the familiar routine and her comrades. The war ended for Maria Kostromina in East Prussia, where she held the rank of junior sergeant and worked as an instructor at a training facility far from any active combat. May 9th, 1945. The victory she had fought for, that her father had died pursuing, finally arrived. The announcement came over the radio in the barracks common room, and soldiers erupted in celebration around her. They shouted, embraced, wept openly. Maria stood at the window, watching artillery fire a salute into the evening sky, and allowed herself to cry for the first time since that terrible night in April of '43. Not tears of joy, though joy was certainly present, but tears of release, of survival, of profound exhaustion that came from carrying the weight of war for so long. Demobilization came in waves throughout the summer. Maria returned to Voronezh in August to find a city transformed by destruction. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, their buildings reduced to hollow shells and piles of rubble. The shooting range where her father had taught her, where she had spent countless childhood hours, was gone completely, replaced by a crater and scattered debris. She stood at the edge of that crater for a long time, saying a private farewell to Pyotr Kostromyn, whose body lay somewhere in the mass graves around Rzhev, but whose spirit seemed most present here, in this destroyed place where he had passed his knowledge to his daughter. She found work at the factory cafeteria, where she had been employed before the war. The job was familiar in its routines, comforting in its ordinariness. She cooked the same simple meals for workers that she had prepared for soldiers, though the quantities were smaller and nobody was trying to kill her while she worked. Life settled into peacetime patterns gradually, like a river finding its course after spring floods. She met Alexei, a veteran of the tank forces who had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to frostbite during the siege of Leningrad. They married in the spring of '46, understanding each other in ways that only fellow veterans could. Neither spoke much about the war, but they recognized the shadows in each other's eyes. Children came, a son in '47, a daughter in '49. Maria threw herself into motherhood with the same intensity she had brought to everything else in her life. She wanted her children to grow up in peace, to never know the sound of artillery or the smell of burnt powder, to take for granted a world where food was plentiful and tomorrow was reasonably certain. She rarely spoke to them about her wartime service. When they asked, which children inevitably did, she told them she had been a cook. This was true after all. The rest seemed unnecessary, belonged to a different Maria who had existed in a different world. Her rifle had been turned in at demobilization, as regulations required, surrendered to a supply sergeant who recorded its serial number in a ledger without ceremony. But Maria kept a small cloth pouch containing 7 brass cartridge casings, the shells from that April morning. She never displayed them, never showed them to anyone, but sometimes late at night when sleep would not come, she would hold them in her hand, feeling their weight, remembering, not with pride or satisfaction, but with a kind of solemn acknowledgement that these small pieces of metal represented a moment when she had become something other than herself, when necessity had transformed a cook into a killer. The Soviet Union celebrated its war veterans publicly, but often neglected them privately. Maria's medals went into a drawer, worn only on Victory Day each May 9th, when veterans gathered to remember fallen comrades. Her story remained largely unknown outside the 304th Rifle Regiment. Military censors during the war had controlled which stories reached the public, preferring dramatic tales of tank battles and aerial combat over quieter heroism. A cook defending her kitchen did not fit the preferred narrative, despite its genuine drama. Maria did not mind the obscurity. She had not fought for recognition or glory, but for survival and for a country that deserved to exist beyond Hitler's murderous vision. Years passed with the steady accumulation of ordinary life. Her children grew, attended university, married, provided grandchildren. Alexei died in '79, his damaged heart finally giving out. Maria continued working until retirement, then spent her days in the small apartment they had shared, surrounded by photographs of people she had loved. The young woman who had fired 7 perfect shots on an April morning existed now only in memory and in a file somewhere in military archives. She had become Babushka Maria, Grandmother Maria, a small elderly woman who baked excellent bread and never raised her voice. Sometimes young people, learning she was a veteran, would ask what the war had been like. Maria would smile and say it was a long time ago, that she preferred not to dwell on unpleasant memories. This was not entirely true. She thought about the war constantly, especially in her final years. But she found that words could not adequately convey what it had meant to live through those times, to be young when the world was ending, to discover capabilities within herself that peacetime would never have revealed. How could she explain to these children of peace what it felt like to kill another human being? How could she describe the weight of survival when so many others had died? Maria Kostromina died in 1987, surrounded by family in a Voronezh hospital. She was 66 years old. Among her possessions, her children found the cloth pouch with 7 cartridge casings, the 2 medals in their presentation boxes, and a faded photograph of a young woman in military uniform standing beside a field kitchen. They did not understand the significance of these items, not really. But they preserved them anyway, because their mother had kept them. The full story of that April morning remained locked away in military files and in the fading memories of a few surviving veterans who had served with the 304th Rifle Regiment. If there is a lesson in Maria's story, it is perhaps this. War reveals capabilities we never knew we possessed, demands sacrifices we never imagined making, and leaves scars that peacetime cannot fully heal. An ordinary young woman became a warrior when circumstances required it, killed efficiently when survival demanded it, and returned to ordinary life carrying the weight of those extraordinary moments. She was not unique in this. Thousands of Soviet women served in combat roles during the Great Patriotic War, and countless others performed acts of courage that went unrecorded and unrecognized. Maria represents all of them, all the women who fought and died and survived, all the untold stories that shaped the outcome of history's most terrible conflict. Her memory deserves preservation, not because her story was unusual, but precisely because it was not. Because behind every Soviet soldier's uniform was a person with a story, with training and fear and courage, with the capacity to do terrible and necessary things when history demanded nothing less.